name of Islam. And we're doing standing within our faith as Muslim women. Throughout the past year, we've witnessed social media platforms booming with engagement and the emergence of innovative tools to have online conversations and discussions. Hence, bringing us to Standing for Justice Digital Activism series, which is a multi-platform series that's been co-created by national level advocates, activists, and Musawa folks to protest, amplify, and mobilize our calls for an end to discriminatory Muslim family laws and practices. So today, this is our way of taking on the digital space as a space to gather and mobilize our calls. And the conversation is happening right now on Zoom, as well as on Facebook. We're also going to be on Instagram and all the other social media platforms where this conversation will continue to happen. So we encourage you to share, live tweet, and share any other calls to action that you hear from activists today in order to truly amplify the campaign on this amazing day for Women's International Day, actually. So here we are. Episode 3, which we're calling Fearless Feminist Futures, the most alliterative title we could think of, Young Muslim Women's Activism in South and Southeast Asia, with an incredible lineup of young activists from Sri Lanka, Malaysia, and Indonesia, creating narratives where Muslim women are embodying identities that are non-conforming to patriarchal gender ideals, embracing their visibility to simply exist within the space. Now, the speakers. So the speakers we have first. The next slide, please. We have first from Sri Lanka, Nabila Iqbal, the founder of Sisterhood Initiative, which is a volunteer group dedicated to understanding and addressing issues faced by Muslim women in the country. Second, we have from Malaysia, Sisters in Islam's program officer, Nur Huda Ramli. Sisters in Islam is a non-governmental organization working towards advancing the rights of Muslim women in Malaysia. The main focus of SIS is to reform the laws and policies that oppress women's rights. It also raises awareness of issues such as child marriage, female genital mutilation, and polygamy, among others. And finally, last but not least, Dea Safira is joining us from Indonesia. Dea founded Indonesia Feminis, an online multi-platform provider that focuses on making feminism accessible and as a room to discuss current women's rights issues. So now just like a quick brief of how this conversation is going to be formatted. We're using a very unique conversational tool called Anger, Hope, and Action, or in other words, AHA. So the AHA framework was conceptualized originally by Saul Alinsky and used within labor movements to invite people to understand the issues of injustices and pain, take stock of what are hopeful strategies and opportunities in their context, and movements and spur people and communities towards action. And so we've divided these events into these 3 segments. Now, without further ado, I'd like to hand over to my co-mod and pal, Zul, Musawa's Capacity Building and Outreach Program Officer, to get the show started. Zul, the floor is yours.
Hello, hi, thank you, Fatma. Thanks for that great introduction. And thank you all for joining us today. We know that it's a busy day in the middle of your week. So I think Fatima's told us a little bit about our speakers already, but maybe we could begin with setting the context just a little bit more. And I'd like to hear from the speakers about themselves in their own words as well. So Huda, maybe we can start with you. So you work for one of the longest standing Muslim women's organizations, Sisters in Islam in Malaysia. It's a pioneer for women's rights issues in the Muslim world, as well as globally. So could you tell us a little bit more about what got you interested in working with SIS as well as activism?
Hi, everyone. Good evening from Malaysia. Basically, if I want to tell you guys my story, it's not like, you know, it's not like I tumbled upon Sisters in Islam and I liked them suddenly and I joined them. That's not the story. It's in Malaysia, we have a very unique societal condition where the Islamization projects have taken on, I mean, for more than around 40 years, 30 to 40 years, and that impacted our young generations about their understanding of Islam. So basically, I was coming from the background of Islamist families, where, of course, Sisters in Islam is, you know, we saw them as a deviant group trying to mislead Muslims, try to reinterpret the Quran in the way that it's not supposed to be. So I grew up in that situation. Seeing Sisters in Islam is a very bad group. So along the way, when I studied in UIA, in IIUM, International Islamic University, Malaysia, I learned, my background, academic background is Arabic language and literature. So I got involved with certain Salafi students. So I had a privilege to actually learn the religious texts, the first sources of Islam, which is Quran and the Hadith, most importantly, firsthand. Not through interpretations of a certain fiqh book, because in the fiqh book usually you just know the opinions of the ulama, but this when you deal with the prophetic text, right, you look into the text and look at how prophet really say about Islam and whatnot. So and then moving along, I there was a moment in 2000, I think 2009, I really realized that text is something else. Interpretation of text is another thing, where prejudice and bias really affect how the text really being interpreted. And I had this moment with my friend, actually a Salafi person and a very famous ustaz right now. So what happened was we discussed about this hadith mentioning about that father cannot force daughters to marry. And there's this one hadith where there is a lady that is not named in the hadith reported to the prophet that she was forced into a marriage, and then the prophet asked her to bring her father in front of the prophet, and then in front of her father, the prophet asked, "Now what do you want to do about your marriage?" And that hadith actually explicitly give all the women's rights actually to not being forced, and the father does not have the right to force their daughters into marriage. That hadith is very explicit. But my friend, he said that hadith is merely an advice. I was like, what? That's not an advice. That's explicit hadith. Without me knowing that at the end of the hadith, actually the girl come to the prophet is because she actually mentioned this very, literally in front of the prophet. I want to teach other women outside that their fathers have no rights. Have no rights to decide or to make a final decision on their marriage, meaning that their fathers do not have the right to force their daughters to marry anyone that they don't like. So asserting her rights in front of the prophet, even though at the end of the hadith, she mentioned, "Now I am pleased. Now I am okay with my marriage. I want to proceed with my marriage. I just want to teach my father my right." So that hadith is very explicit. But my friend, he was very weird. He said that no, that hadith was just merely an advice, because there's other hadith, "La nikaha illa biwali." It means that actually it was an ambiguous hadith. So there's no nikah without wali. It's being interpreted as the wali have the right to force the daughter into marriage, which is very wrong. And that was my first turning point of truth, in which that interpretation of text is another thing that actually corrupts our religious narrative. That is one thing. And then moving along, my postgraduate studies in IIUM, I got to know about feminism, and I had a lot of stuff going on around and kind of debate and whatnot. Yeah, in 2018, I realized that what Sisters in Islam, doing is that trying to bring the women's voice in the interpretation of the text, and that is not something that Sisters in Islam does alone. Bringing along with the scholars and the resources that is very credible. I thought that when I joined Sisters in Islam in 2019, I thought I can contribute to Sisters in Islam. Instead, I was humbled by vast resources that make me like, okay, this is something else. So yeah, that's my journey with Sisters in Islam. But I think it really gives me something the idea where actually Islamization projects in Malaysia really impact the Malaysians, how religion is being portrayed. And the fatwa that is being imposed on sisters in Islam is actually one of the effects of the Islamization projects, where the idea of conservative, conservative religious narratives is being, is being the state religious narrative that is being imposed. And with the Islamists, being here and there, influencing the public, influencing the policymakers. Yeah, so that's why we are here right now.
Great, thanks for that. And I think what you said resonates with a lot of people, because I see the rest of our panelists nodding as well. So that one issue where we then begin to question and you look into it more and you realize it's a much deeper problem. And so I'm going to switch and go on to a bit of a different context than Malaysia, which is a minority context. So Nabila, you come from a minority Muslim community in Sri Lanka, and you founded the Sisterhood initiative. Could you tell us what spurred that action and what got you involved in activism as well?
Thanks so much, Zuleika, and I'm so happy to be on this panel today on International Women's Day, especially sharing it with you all. I think it's super. So my name is Nabila. I actually come from a peace building background because our country, it has been through a lot of conflict, especially a civil war close to 3 decades. So we were the generation born right after that. So we had to navigate so much of communal violence and racism and issues like that. So I found it really important to be involved in peace building and bringing communities together and interfaith discussions and harmony and things like that. But it never occurred to me that even within communities, we need to talk to each other and we need to understand each other because we're so different. And I realized this, we were once on a tour. Our country is a small island. We were once on a tour around the island, and there I was speaking to one of my mentors, and she was telling me, as much as interfaith community is important, intra-faith conversations are as important, and we need to really create that space. But that idea, I had that idea for a while. I don't think I found anybody else who felt the same way at the time. But then later on, I found a lot of Muslim women who believed in the same sort of mission and vision. And it made it more clear to me that within minority communities, women also don't have that same access or rights to educate or rights to information or education and information and things like that. So that's why it became even more important for us to just come together and create this space. So I'm really happy to just share my experiences with you.
Great, thanks so much for sharing that, Nabila. And so just before I ask you another question, I'm going to go to Dea first. Dea, you come from, again, a vastly different context, which is Indonesia, which has the largest population of Muslims in the world. And you're a Sokmed diva, and you've been using multiple platforms to raise really big issues like sexual health, as well as reproductive rights. Could you tell us a little bit about how you got involved in gender and social justice issues and what your experience of that was in Indonesia?
So first of all, I'm just going to say something. Actually, my grandfather was actually an ulema in the kampung, in the villages. And so growing up, I had my dad talking about the stories of the prophets. So I was like familiar with it, but he did not have any gender perspective, but I think he was building up my spiritual lens. But that didn't stop me from questioning a lot what I learned, especially in Indonesia. We have experienced the same thing as Malaysia. We had an Islamization project, and it grew after the new order, which is the Orde Baru, after Suharto was taken down. And so democracy was open to anyone, and everyone could talk about anything, including religion, but it also gave a leeway to this narrative of Islam. And my generation was in the intersection of both polarizing views. You know, both had their own views, and it was very strong, especially with social media being so open and unfiltered. So it was easy for people to get by. And how I did I jumped on social media. Well, obviously our generation is so close to social media, and it was like a runaway from me, from my daily life. I'm actually a dentist, a part-time dentist. And even in dental school, I actually learned a lot about the bias, the stereotypes, and also learned about the systemic problems that our country has inflicted within the years. And it was so embedded in my patient. It was my patients showed me how the systemic oppression that we've had caused severe poverty. And from that, I've realized that something was wrong. And through that, it gave me a lot of strength and power. And just because it was also very interesting, because as a Muslim majority in Indonesia, we also had opposing views of how the right Islam should be, you know, how the kafah Islam is. So it was very interesting. And today we are still, how do you say it? Still, I don't know how to say it in English. Still merebutkan, or still, you know, still in the process of how do we define what being a true Muslim is. As even if you're a feminist and you're a Muslim, you're still defining. And that's how we all grew up here, defining ourselves. Still contesting, yes.
Yeah, and I think that self-definition is also a way that a lot of us come into this movement. And you've talked about using social media as a space. So before we go, I'm going to ask my co-mod. Fatima, you come from a comms and journalist background as well. How did you get into activism?
I have a lot of answers for that, being at Musawa.
I'll give you 3 minutes.
3 minutes, okay. That's a good time frame, actually. I think for me, it started off, so I'm originally born and raised in Hong Kong, and it's a very, very tiny city of a people where they're, you know, Muslims, Black and brown people are probably in like the 5% there. So it's like when you're there, you kind of don't exist and you don't matter to the majority. So you're almost always ostracized growing up, whether it's, you know, the socioeconomic issues that you have to go through growing up, and the language hurdles because you must speak the language of the majority and you can't get by just speaking in English. I think a lot of immigrants understand the struggle here. But for me, it kind of started off by doing collective organizing work, not so much in the women's rights space, but in the refugee and asylum seeker space. Because in Hong Kong, the refugee crises are not really isolated to, you know, just one area, but they have its own sets of issues where asylum seekers lack legal aid, money, psychological support. For instance, even single mothers, lots of them are in Hong Kong, are unable to rely on any income, and they only get a subsidy of just say about $10, $10 US a month. And you can say that that money is supposed to go to housing costs. So things like that, I feel like has kind of helped me or sort of mobilized me to realize that, listen, you know, if I have the power and if I have the influence and the reach to write and to, you know, tell people the real stories instead of what mainstream journalism and what mainstream storytellers do, I'm going to humanize these people. And I'm going to make sure that, you know, I have to hold the line and open the gates of the truth, which a lot of journalists kind of forgo and don't think about in their writing. And through that, I think I just found my voice as an activist, writer, journalist, and that just brought me to Musawa. Now I'm comms/journalist. I think it's pretty much on the same level, but yeah. But I mean, that's my story though, and it's very like a small kind of, you know, ripple, I guess. But what about you from the Maldives? So
okay, so I'll focus my answer on specifically how, for me, coming into activism and working on women's rights within like the space of religion specifically. Maybe that's how I can sort of say succinct and keep to time. And for me, it was really, I came from a place of curiosity. And if I'm being completely honest, a bit of confusion or a lot of confusion. So like you, Fatima, as someone who's moved around and you get to experience both sides of the coin, and often they're two very different extremes. So on the one side, you have the minority context, and in the diaspora, we face Islamophobia, and oftentimes Muslim women are spoken for. And by that, I mean, statements are made about our oppression, what we wear, conflicts are started in the name of protecting Muslim women. And then you get to the flip side of the coin, which is where Islam is also spoken for. So in Muslim majority contexts, and in the case of Maldives, where I'm from, where it's an absolute majority, we are told what religion is, what is acceptable, and hence what becomes law and what becomes social practice. And this is often controlled, of course, by patriarchal narratives. And so what you see is theology is being used as a tool to intimidate activists into silence. So activists that argue for change are being intimidated with the use of theology. And so I think as a result of that, I got into this space through feminist inquiry. And so it starts with asking the question of, okay, if these practices and how we live are based on religion, a religion that is supposed to be about justice and kindness and fairness, then why is it so discriminatory to half the world's population? And so, yeah, so for me, I think, like many other young women like me, feminist activism was a space where I could look at these intersections and try to reconcile those multiple identities that live within ourselves. Yeah, so I think that's how I found myself within the movement and within the Musawa space, to be specific. But on that, I want to go back to the question that I had for Nabila in the beginning, which is, being from your context, which is a minority context, you know these two forces quite well as well. And so, for example, you have the resistance that you mentioned from within your community, but you also have the other side of resistance from Islamophobic or ultranationalist groups. And we saw that most recently with the current proposed changes to the Sri Lankan Muslim Marriage and Divorce Act. Could you speak a little to that, as well as what are the issues that Muslim women are picking up in the country, and what are they most concerned about at present?
So Zuleika, if I had to, I think, narrow it down to a few issues that women face when it comes to being in this space of racism and also challenges within the community, I think number one is women are not seen as equal to men. They're not seen equal to their counterpart. That's definitely number one. I think you mentioned this as well. Women are seen as people who need to be protected, and we can see that in our current Muslim personal law reforms, where a lot of the reforms that have been proposed are being pushed by extremely conservative groups in the name of, oh no, we need to protect women, we need to maintain polygamy to protect women, we need, women signature, sure they can sign, but also let's have a guardian sign on behalf of her. I mean, that's the narratives that are coming right in. And second is, you have other people speaking on behalf of us. And whether it's men or whether it's non-Muslims in general, I think Muslim women are just seen as feeble, can't represent themselves, probably don't have a voice, and probably not important, whatever they say. Maybe they lack education. Like, that's the sort of stereotype that they have of us. And I think the last one is, like, just to further what I said before, like, I think that's that negative stereotype that they have of us, especially in the media. Recently, there was this issue last month where far east of the country, where a teacher was not allowed into school because of the abaya she was wearing. So again, that's clothing being policed and things like that. I wrote this passage in a book, and I just love to read it out, if that's okay with you. Muslim women are the stereotype of second-class citizens in this country. the scapegoat when situations in the community become tough, and if at all, the last to be consulted on decisions concerning our own lives, whether it's about our bodies, our attire, marriage, or career. It's always someone else calling the shots. The media likes to portray us as oppressed or backward. Muslim men want to own our agency. Politicians decide on our clothing with the aim of national security, and the list is endless. And finally, all these stakeholders need us in society, but not as equal beings. We are here, but we are not heard. We're like props in a play. And that's so important, like you mentioned, in personal law reforms as well. There are so many lived realities that women are facing, that are the harmful conditions that they're going through because reforms are not had. And the same groups that are delaying reforms do not understand that at whose cost are they delaying reforms. It's always the Muslim woman and always her voice that's not heard or given space to. That's something I'm very passionate about. And of course, the first part of this session is anger, and something that I'm very angry about as well. And with that, I think I'll leave it over to somebody else.
Great. Thank you so much for sharing that, Nabila. So with that anger, I want to go to Huda. Do you see any similarities with what's raised by Nabila? And if you could as well, maybe tell us the top 2 or 3 issues that are on the radar of Muslim women in Malaysia.
If I want to tell you the list, it'll be long list.
Top
It's
3.
just, non-stop. It's just non-stop every day. But I think I can narrow it down to few key points. Women's issues, it is being raised every day. It's always something, today will be issue A, and then tomorrow will be issue B. You have a lot of things going on, but I can put it pinpoint it into one or two main problems. Number one, the Islamist anti-rights movement infiltrating and penetrating the democratic Malaysian democratic space, not just our public space, but also our civil society space. And that's very problematic because the idea of the idea of ideal Muslimah, ideal women, in the eyes of the conservatives and Islamists is being being projected on the society. So right now they are being more sophisticated in their language. They use the human rights language. They use the liberal rights language right now. So you would hear they actually, instead of we use UDHR standard principles, they are actually trying to, divert that into Cairo Declaration of Human Rights, which we know is very problematic because it's quite, it's very problematic because it compromises a lot of rights, especially on women's and also gender minorities and religious minorities and whatnot. And then another thing is that that is anti-right movement, which actively infiltrating these spaces through civil organizations. And another thing is that I think the most problems that the most problematic thing that I'm seeing currently is that it's always the Islamists who, voicing out against these issues, or let's say the women issues being raised, right? It's always, Islamists always say something opposite to women's rights. For example, we talk about unilateral conversion at the current moment, which actually trying to put aside the mother's rights, mother's consent in the conversion of their kids under 18. The Islamists actually focusing on the rights of the kids not to being reconverted back to the old religion, number one, without actually the Islamists actually do not consider at all the right of the mothers. The consent of the mothers must be got before the children is being converted. So it's always Islamists are trying to divert the issue. And it's quite interesting right now because in Malaysia, a lot of I think a lot of people have started to get awareness about women's issues. Islamists talk about women's issues, and actually their narratives are being picked up, and that's what worries us most lah. And I think it's so funny right now. They're actually providing the alternative to the liberal rights or liberal civil rights that we always fight for, with the Islamic, with Islamic version, but it's not Islamic. It's Islamist version of women's rights. So yeah, I think that's the most problematic things right now in Malaysian scene. Second thing is that if we go down further, actually, people cannot shield themselves from these kind of narrative, or try even to differentiate what's right and what's wrong, because to differentiate which is right religious alternative or wrong religious narratives. So I think the challenge here is that the knowledge that we have currently must be disseminated as widely as possible with the language of the natives, especially Malay here lah. Because usually the human rights discourse, the feminism and whatnot is always being discussed in English. It's not in Malay. So of course, the Malay conservatives, the Malay society or Malay communities, which we know the conservatism is there, in as the main idea. So it's really hard actually to counter that without knowledge of the progressive Islam being disseminated in Malay language. I think that's our struggle right now, not just voicing out about women's struggle every day. Our narratives, but also the knowledge itself must be disseminated. So that's what I'm seeing lah.
Okay, thanks for that. Like you mentioned array of issues. So there's conversion, there's consent of mothers and the powers of mothers when it comes to their children. But it seems like a lot of it boiled down to the narrative and controlling that narrative. And so I'm going to go to Dea next. And so I would like to ask you, what are the types of narratives and conversations arising in Indonesia and online specifically? So what do you think are the points of anger for Muslim feminists in Indonesia?
Okay, in Indonesia, there are a lot of myths, and these myths are being produced over and over again, especially when they try to intertwine it with religion, especially in Islam. And so I remember there's this one story in Madura. It's an island on top of Java. It's there in the east of Java. And the women there have this ongoing myth, like if you deny a marriage proposal, no matter how young you are, you will have this brand, which is called perempuan sangkal, a woman who denies. I don't know how to translate that, but it means perempuan sangkal. So if you deny a marriage, this brand will bring you everywhere. It's on your forehead. And so because parents are afraid that their child will have this brand, so they kind of force the women or even the girls to get married. And so this also gives a lot of ways to underage marriage, and also obviously to violence. And it's so hard for especially young women to get out of these stereotypes and myths and so on, especially when the culture itself is being permissive. And so not just the culture, even the system, the court, I think the Muslim court or something, they also give permission under the context to avoid premarital sex or zina. So because of that, a lot of the people, or just because of the myth itself, a lot of the families force their daughters to get married. And even if they deny, even if the daughter denies, they will still get. So these myths are very strong, and it's so intertwined, it's so oppressive, it's so repressing. That is just one myth. There are a lot of them which I cannot list, but also I just want to say it also comes with this Islamization also. And this Islamist, the one that Nur Huda mentioned, it also, they try to offer their sort of narrative, the same here, but then again, it's actually not really Islamic at all. So it goes the same ways there, here and there.
Yeah, that is such an interesting myth. I haven't heard that one before. But clearly there is a lot to be angry about. And so with that, we don't want to end with anger. So I'm going to hand over to Fatima, who's going to help us talk a little bit about the kind of activism we can do on all of these issues that were just raised. Over to you.
Basically, there is light at the end of the tunnel. We're all very angry and outraged, but there's hope. So under hope, what we're going to be basically asking our panelists is how they do activism. What are some of the opportunities of activism that people and women especially can participate in those countries, and what are they actually hopeful about? So I'm going to start with Nabila, specifically with Sisterhood Initiative, the volunteer-led group that you found. How does Sisterhood Initiative actually organize and mobilize young Muslim women? And what are some of the hopeful stories of change of how young women have engaged in these conversations safely, but also online?
Thanks, Fatima. First of all, Sisterhood Initiative, or SI, was created online. So what happened was I did this video discussing a few issues, and then women reached out, and then we created a network, and then we met in person. So actually an Instagram video just created, like, snowballed into like a really young grassroots organization. And what we try to do within our group is to have these conversations that are really difficult. So it's around race, it's around women's rights, family law reforms, just sometimes even really simple things like finance for women, things that are really essential. We try to have these conversations, and it's mainly with a focus for Muslim women, because we realize that they don't have that same kind of access to a lot of information because of the minority labels. But we do it in solidarity with non-Muslims in our country. And this is so important to us because we don't carry a religious tag on our group. We represent all religions and anyone who feels safe to be in our group. And that gets misunderstood a lot, because then it's like, oh, what are a bunch of Muslim looking women doing and talking about non-Islamic things? So we get into that fights a lot, but we have to like explain, no, we're not a religious group, but that's different. So what we've realized is when we've invited women at a seat at the table, we realized for how long they will keep talking, because for such a long time, nobody has actually listened to them, let alone given them a chance to speak. And sometimes they go home and they reach out back to us. And some of them are also women who have extremely horrible realities that they have to go through at homes. Maybe it's domestic violence or abuse or issues with their partners. And then they find this as an avenue to reach out to help from us. And that's something we see as it's a huge achievement, just to be able to create that bridge between these women. So, I mean, yeah, I think just creating a safe space just achieves women to do so much. Of course, people watching it from the outside who don't understand what we're doing, we always get the comments like, oh, so you all just get around a group of people and just talk, like that's all you do, you all just chat. And it's difficult because even talking is a privilege sometimes when you've been denied access to a space for so long. And so for us, it's a huge privilege. We take it very seriously, and we try to convert these conversations into action in our communities by organizing and getting together and meeting out more.
Thank you so much for sharing that with us, Nabila. And I'm just going to quote her here. Talking itself is a privilege that I think a lot of people don't understand, that a lot of women go through. We don't have a voice in the house that I think most people won't really see. It's not visible, but it is silence, and silence is deafening. So thank you so much for creating this space for women in Sri Lanka, because that's all we want to do. We just want to talk, and we love talking. So why not, you know? So, you know, it's a great thing that this is happening, but I'm going to get back to you on that one. Dea, in Indonesia, right? So there are lots of contending and contradicting views about Islam and women's rights and roles, like the myths you were mentioning. So, you know, looking at all of these like traditional norms and values that a lot of the groups, like conservative groups in Indonesia hold, how are you in the 21st century using, like, you know, all these digital mediums like social media to get messages across? Like, how do you galvanize people to act on social media online?
Okay, so most of all, I mostly do collaboration. Sometimes I invite them to do live Instagram and do, or just curating content from their own media, and I think that gives them the space to speak, like they say, like Nabila said, it's such a privilege. So I invite a lot of, currently I'm inviting a lot of content creators just to like, hey, if you want to post something and if you want to get more exposure, please do invite as a collaborator, and it will be very helpful for you to get your message out. So I think for me, it's all about the people itself, the community we're trying to build. And it's also just being in touch with different kind of people working there. It just, and connecting them, it just gives us much more courage and much more knowledge of what we could share, because I myself cannot do this alone if I don't share the platform that I already built. I have like 115,000 followers on Instagram, and if I don't share it, if I don't use this public platform for other people, so it won't be fair. So what I try to do is, please do come by and tell us how we can help to amplify your voices, because this is the only way, not just the only way, but maybe through social media, this is how we could have their message sent across all platforms. And it's interesting because I'm not just highlighting about how Islam is actually non-discriminatory, or it's not just about Islam. There are actually other religions who has their own gender perspective. And when we brought that to our platform, it just invites a lot of discussion. And that is what I want. And that's what I wanted to build. So that's how it is.
And the organization is called Indonesia Feminis, you guys. So please.
It's actually not an organization. It's just a space, you know, just space to people talking.
Yeah, a multi-platform space, right? That you're all across online, so people will be able to talk through your platform. And that's great, because for over 200 million Muslims in Indonesia, one of the largest Muslim countries in the world, it's great that you're actually spreading this kind of message, because it's uncommon, it's unpopular opinion for most people. And I'm sure you get a lot of pushback also, you know, online, and different issues that you have to deal with, like hate speeches and trolls and things like that. I mean, we'll also get to that point on how do you also, you know, counter that. But yeah, I think you have something to say, Dea. Say it, just say it.
Especially when we try to reinterpret our own religion and in the gender perspective. We had so much trolls when we posted about, actually it was a repost from Mubadalah. It was about women being their own wali to get married without a male wali, and it just invited a lot of discussion, and it was wow. And even in the feminist space itself, there's still people who are not bold or brave enough to deconstruct what they have learned, and that is a challenge that we need to like fight over.
Yes. And, you know, having the courage to do that requires a collective voice. That's why it's important for more people, you know, a multiplicity of people and voices to be a part of your platforms, like Nabila's, like yours. And I mean, these are online platforms, and this is something that a lot of us Gen Z millennials are kind of familiar with. But of course, we should talk about the older movements that have also come through, you know, Sisters in Islam. Hi, Huda. So what I want to ask you is that, you know, Sisters in Islam started off and continued to be a radical organization in a majority Muslim country in Malaysia. So as a young woman, as Sisters in Islam right now, Huda, how has the move to use emerging technologies benefited or hindered the movement as a whole? And how have young women in Malaysia been having more meaningful and intersectional conversations online?
Okay. Actually, with the before this, before the pandemic, basically, we didn't have a chance to actually open our discourse to public a lot and more widely, because we of course, with the fatwas imposed on us, and people are actually, you know, seeing Sisters in Islam is the enemy of Islam, it's really not Malaysia is really not a conducive place for you to have an open dialogue under the name of Sisters in Islam usually. But interestingly, after pandemic happens and we had to change our discourse and dialogues to online platform, we embarked on, you know, constant and consistent knowledge dissemination to public audience. So I thought that so basically, because I'm doing this with my unit in ONE outreach empowerment, same like Zul. So basically, I would you know, anticipate a lot of backlash would come. You know, when we talk about the alternative narratives of fiqh, for example, in a lot of issues, and also we talk about things, for example, hijab. You know, hijab is not compulsory. It's not an easy topic to discuss openly, basically. But we do it, you know, not we in terms of discourse, right? Because this is a knowledge thing, you know, intellectual discussion. We discuss books, we discuss films, we discuss a lot of things with the scholars, with the ulama, and we bring it on the online platform to the public audience. Interestingly, what happened was we did not receive a lot of backlashes from the Islamists. That is very interesting phenomenon, actually. If compared to, you know, if we, you know, issued a statement regarding whatever issues that usually, you know, controversial in Malaysia, for example, the unilateral conversion, a lot of issues actually. That usually would come with, you know, backlash from the Islamist groups. But for the programs that is, you know, involving knowledge dissemination, involving public intellectual discourse, we did not receive much backlash. So I think this is actually where the Islamists have their weaknesses, you know, cannot do anything to us, because the power that we have is the knowledge, and they don't have that. The only way that they can influence people all this while is through indoctrination and dogmas. And, you know, you can shield yourself from this indoctrination if you have knowledge. So apparently, interestingly, they do not have knowledge to actually counter us. So I think that's actually actually eye-opening for us, that we should always be, you know, confident in knowledge dissemination. So I think with the privilege that we had all here, whatever that I know and we at Sisters in Islam know, I think for the better of the for the better of society, it must be spread out. So yeah, online platform is very beneficial for us, and that's really eye-opening lah. And I think that really, you know, make us quite not really so scared, you know, with the backlash from the Islamists. So yeah, they did not have power over us on that.
This is
Exactly.
what we're talking about when we say fearless. Women, like fearlessness
Yeah.
is the reason. So knowledge is power, and being fearless is the method through which we disseminate the knowledge. So I think that's a good takeaway from that. And Nabila, so I think the same question also for you. Looking at MPL RAG and all the other older movements and organizations that work towards women's rights in Sri Lanka, how has that also kind of helped you in, I guess, also pushing out narratives that disrupt the normally very patriarchal and and the misogynistic stories and issues and things that are brought up that is meant to spite women and girls, especially back in the day when the digital space wasn't as popular as it is today. How are you incorporating those methods and messages of mobilizing in Sisterhood Initiative?
I'd say something really personal to me is this past year with the pandemic, being online and organizing and working. It has been really draining. It has been also really tiring. But this year we just said, you know what, we'll try to be careful with COVID and we'll travel this time. Like we'll travel and we'll meet women's groups that we've always met online. And through that, we've met IWA, that's in Katangkudi, Eastern Province. We've met in MWDT, that's in Puttalam, and we're always in touch with MPL RAG. And when you meet these women from these communities and they find you as your equals and they treat you like, the next generation or part of the same community, it gave me so much of energy. I think I've been really quiet for a while and I've been hibernating, but now I feel like that energy is there. And it's really funny because usually when younger people go into a much mature community, they look to you for energy, but this is the other way around where I felt like, oh, now I feel like super charged up. And I think that's the beauty of working together. Sure, it takes a bit of time to gain some trust. There might be a little bit of gatekeeping, which does not supposed to come off the right way, but it sort of comes off a little bit that way. But with a little bit of trust and working together and finding that that common identity in that community just gives you so much of strength and so much of knowledge. Just sharing information, sharing resources, sharing advice. And it's really funny when I came back last weekend or this weekend, someone said to me, she's much older than I am, and she said, I love traveling with you all because I feel young again. And I didn't want to tell her that I felt young too, even though I am already young. I think that's great. I think between generations, we need to talk to each other because some of the issues we're facing have been faced before. And we can face them again if it has to be done.
And just to follow up for you, Nabila, as a young Muslim woman, being inspired by all the women that came before you and the ones that are still with you in the movement now for, MMDA reform in Sri Lanka, for example, and to actually move towards real and legitimate changes in the country so that, the laws are no longer discriminating women. How hopeful are you that, maybe in the short term or in the long term, there will be progression and there will be, I guess, and for a lack of a better term, liberation, I guess, for women to express themselves and to exist in all spaces?
I'm a very cynical person. So, since you asked me this, I think my aim in my work has always been, regardless of what governments decide, regardless of what decision makers, lawmakers decide, we need to take care of our own communities. We need to give them the knowledge, the advice, the resources, and the protection, and just make them feel safe. So for me, the hope I have is, regardless of what happens, I know that I will be there, my friends will be there, my colleagues will be there, people older than I am and younger than I am will always be there to continue this support and sharing these resources and just taking care of each other. Because I think it's very strong in our religion too, to look out of the self, out of our own identity, and also reach out and come together as a group. so that we share responsibility and care for each other. So I have hope that that will definitely happen.
Cynicism with a tinge of optimism, right, Nabila? Just like a little pinch of it.
Yeah.
Dea, how about you? One thing that you're hopeful for as a young Muslim woman in Indonesia?
So what I've been facing a lot of this time is women being uncertain of what they believe in. And so this is unsettling for me because they lack the confidence, which I understand where it came from, because after years of being marginalized and ostracized, they don't have the capacity. They do have the capacity, but they don't have that level of confidence to speak up, or they might not be living in an environment that is very friendly to what they think, or so on. But that does not mean they cannot speak up. So what I want to try to say is trust your common sense, because that is the most beautiful thing that God has ever given us as humankind. And that's the only thing that every Muslim scholars that I've encountered, they always say that humans are, I'm not saying better, but we have been gifted the common sense, and that is why we are the Khalifa of this earth. So why don't we try to embody that and spiritualize that? And for me, activism is also a spiritual awakening and realizing that, this is my call. This is what I've been put on earth to do. So that should be our main mode of working on when we try to speak up or speak out. And so I try to, like, if you believe in God, then you should also believe that we've been given all of this resources, our health, our bodies, and it should be used for the common good. And then also I also agree that we have to learn from the generations before us, but that does not mean we try to put them on a pedestal, but also like to understand that our system just does not come like that. It was built without having women in it, without having women as lawmakers, as builders. So we need to realize that even our own nation, the laws written are not inclusive towards women and others. So by learning our history, maybe from each of every different country, our geopolitics has affected the way we live. So we need to learn our history, because most of the time we don't try to understand what's been happening. And that's the problem with, that's actually the problem and the challenge with young feminists today. And be brave and bold enough to deconstruct what we've learned, because even when it comes to understanding religion deeper, we have to be able to deconstruct what we've learned all this time. So and be open to it, and be open to the fact that yes, God has actually given other alternatives for us to understand this and that. So that's my message of hope.
Beautiful message, Dea. Also very quotable. All three of you are, honestly. So there's a question from one of our participants that I want to pose to Huda. So Huda, someone said, why do you think, why do you think feminism is essential for Muslim women? Also kind of just thinking about, the waves of feminism that came also before us, in early on, it was co-opted by mostly white women, the suffragettes, and Betty Friedan's the book on feminism, but it was only focused on mostly white women's struggles. So today we see that the intersectionality is key in order for us to become true feminists. Why do you think that's important? And where does that come from Islam for Muslim women?
First of all, if we need to understand that feminism actually rooted from women's experience. So if white women's experience is different from us, so as long as they are fighting sexism in their own in their own space, in their own community, that depends that depends on how their experience facing the sexism in their own community. So we are not supposed to look for example, the fight of white women against the sexism in their own society, and us is basically something that should be contradicting each other. It's just our framework of looking at things are very different. So intersectionality is definitely important, but we should know that we shouldn't demonizing each other, so that solidarity is not crumbled, because at this particular moment what we really need is women's solidarity against all forms of sexism, racism, and whatever discrimination is on earth. And basically, yeah, we know that the main problem of it is patriarchy and misogyny at the heart of it. Okay, come again the question, what is the why feminism is important, right? So feminism actually provided us the lens, the gender lens, looking into problems, amplifying the women's experience and voices, because we have these problems when we tell society women's issues. They would not see women's issues as humans issues. They see as women's issues, they see women's issues as women's issues per se. They do not see it as a problem of the humanity. That's the problem. Because the standard of humanity is basically put on upon man. Man is the standard of humanity. So that is very problematic. And our problems is being dismissed. So feminism provided the lens of gender. Looking into the problems of women is also part of the humanity problem. That is, I think, that's what lacking in the mainstream views of how how one issue is being seen or being perceived. So, and why it is important for Muslim women, the fight against sexism and discrimination against women have been started since the Prophet's time, but we do not have the name of it. But if we believe that feminism at the heart of it is women's experience, then we know that whatever fight that have been started by the Sahabiyah during the Prophet's time, by the Ummahat al-Mu'minin, by Aisha, by Khadija, and by all the Ummahat al-Mu'minin against discriminations that happens in women's life, right? Then we know that whatever they are doing, actually we are just continuing their work. Because if the Sahabiyah actually do not fight against the discrimination against women during the earliest time of Islam, Islam will not be, Islam would not be good. There are a lot of practices is going to be continuous if there were no there were no Sahabiyah fought against it. For example, the forced marriage. For example, the idea of women can be how do we say this? Women can be trade, or women can be enslaved and whatnot. So
Yeah.
these ideas, if we just continuing their work. Basically, it's just during this modern time, there is one specific term that we can give to it, which is feminism. So at the heart of it is the women's experience. So yeah, we're just continuing their work. It's just we just need to explain this to others lah, because basically when we talk about feminism, a lot of people would feel like, oh, this is un-Islamic.
Yeah.
I also want to add
explaining that thing.
Yeah. You have to add something?
Yeah.
like how every time we talk about, it's all about women's experience, and every time we hear about stories of the Prophet, women comes with their experience and ask for wisdom from the Prophet itself. So it's always about women's experience, and it's always highlighted in that way.
Zoe, I think, do you also have something to add to this question?
Yes, yeah. And I'm really glad that someone raised this question, because it comes up a lot about why do Muslim women need to be feminists, but also I feel like they go hand in hand.
Yeah.
And so the idea that being a feminist is un-Islamic, I can't comprehend, right? Because I feel like my religious values bolsters my feminism. And they do come in hand, and in some places they have to. So even today, it's International Women's Day, but we're specifically speaking with Muslim feminists. And so why do we've been asked, why bring in religion? And for places, and especially places like the Maldives where you're born Muslim by law, you have to speak about it. You can't, it's always used, like I said, it's always used to silence women when they try to argue for change and when they try to argue for rights. And so you can't take religion out of that space. And speaking of inspiration from other feminists, there's a quote that we say at Musawa all the time. And it's, if religion is used for law and public policy, which governs all our lives, then all of us have a right to speak on it. And so if religion is about, justice and fairness and being kind to one another, then I feel like feminism and Islam go hand in hand. But yes, that was my addition.
Thank you so much for sharing, Zoe. Nabila, do you have anything to add to this before we continue?
Nothing extra. I feel like you guys did that well, so I'll just help you move along.
Yeah, that's true. All three of you had fantastic responses. Even I have nothing to say about it, but I think it's important to kind of just summing it up now, because there were people in the comments that also brought up like where is the founding of the feminism, how did it begin, and whether it was founded on patriarchy. And we know that if it wasn't for the existence of patriarchy, the existence of racism, all of which are social constructs, then we wouldn't be doing what we're doing today, because we know that these are all man-made. We know that these have been coming before us and controlling us, and now have been couched into our systems, and systems from the home, from the family unit. That's why it's important for us to talk about Muslim family laws, as we're also speaking about women's rights issues generally. So with that, I would like to move on to mobilization, aka organizing, aka action. So it's you.
Yes, great. I'm most excited about this part. So I think what you said, Fatima, is a perfect entrance into our action section, because countries, and by countries I mean, governments, people in power, they continue to sustain these practices and frameworks that are quite archaic, if I'm being honest. And so it's not reflective of the contemporary realities we live in today, or even 10 to 15 years ago, for that matter. So what are we going to do about it? So I'm going to first go to Huda. So when CIS was formed, there was really no other group in the Muslim world that was using and speaking on Islam from a rights perspective. What would be your advice to other women who want to get involved? And in your opinion, again, top three key issues of what women should be focusing on?
Okay, this is quite hard for me to answer. But what I'm seeing right now, there are a few things that I'm seeing, because basically right now with the advance of the social media platform, right? Basically the activism that we are seeing rising everywhere. But what I'm seeing currently is the gap of knowledge that is still there. With the lack of knowledge, it's really hard to counter the Islamist narratives of Islam for women. Basically, it's against women and discriminatory against women, but it's being, using the religious language, it's, being sugar-coated as something that is actually for women. So the gap of knowledge is very visible there. What my advice would be is that Muslim women who want to be involved in this, fighting against the sexism, patriarchy, and misogyny and whatnot, I would advise that seeking knowledge is the thing that you really need to do. I know seeking knowledge is very, you know, a very privileged, it's a very privileged issue. But I think everybody that have been involved in this, you know, in this space, I think to a certain point, they do have, you know, access to a lot of resources. You can actually reach, you know, scholars. You can reach also sisters in Islam, and then you can reach a lot of resources in terms of books, writings, and whatnot. That is very important because I believe this. My experience, you know, the thing that made me being able to sit here with the feminist groups, fighting with them together against the discrimination in the name of Islam against women is because the knowledge that I received, the knowledge that I seek as well actively. I look for feminism. I look for Islam. I look into the text. Of course, being the Arabic student, I have the privilege of, you know, understanding the language, but that also might be, you know, the key of, you know, the liberation of you guys, of women's actually. What I can say is this, as you know, someone has been in that language background, knowing the language is really a privilege because you cannot control you basically being shielded from being controlled by the narrative of those ulama and the ustaz that is very patriarchal and misogynistic. If you do not have that tools, it's really hard to actually to debunk that. But let's see, if you do not have that privilege to access to that, it's okay, it's fine. But as long as you search for knowledge to fill in the gaps, because at the heart of it, the challenge is actually what are the alternative narratives in Islam? It is there. It's just that we need to search for it. That can fuel the activism, you know, way more. I mean, advanced phase, and I believe that all of us here are here because of that as well. That is number one. Number two,
Okay.
solidarity. Yeah, solidarity is very important.
Okay, so really quickly, did you have one more point, Huda? Sorry.
One sentence.
Okay.
One sentence, just one sentence.
Go for it.
The problem with the problem with patriarchy is that it makes women's problem become individualized, where actually it makes women's problem becomes a personal issue rather than a societal problems and also cultural problems. That is very, you know, very normalized. So the way to counter this is with solidarity, and solidarity you cannot get it without, you know, listening to other people, to other women's voices and experiences and trusting their voice. That is most important. At that level, we must do that so that solidarity can be there.
Okay, thank you, Huda. And you touched on this a little bit, and it's come up as a question as well. And I'm going to pose it to Dea and Nabila as you go into your calls of action as well. So Zarin says, patriarchy is rich and fully resourced, whereas feminism is under-resourced. So we know sort of that balance. So in your opinion, as you do your calls of action, what are new strategies that can be used to counter this? So Dea, would you like to go first? And then we'll go to Nabila.
This is actually very hard because I cannot speak for all women. Especially where there's a gap. Especially there's a technology gap, and not a lot of women and young girls have the access towards internet or even to gadgets. So what I can do is try to make feminism accessible in terms of social media, and probably what I do is I also do some meetups just to like get to know other girls and other women that are interested in the feminist issue. And then what I also do is do a feminist book club also here, but in Indonesian language. So that's just the basic, because it's in the middle of a pandemic. You just can't get out here. So what I do is like get in touch online. But what I'm also looking is a lot of women are also in the grassroots movement. They go and they meet a lot of women who are actually doing the work, the activism work, and doing the solidarity work. What I'm trying to say is that these works are very difficult to access. Like, it's in the village, it's in the kampung, it's where it's unreachable by us feminists who are actually so comfortable in our own homes. So we need more feminist spaces that can facilitate the experience of women, because there's just so many going on in Indonesia, especially in the Muslim scene, and it's actually very hard to reach them. And even with social media, it's just so hard to, hey, it's okay, it's so hard to get in touch with other Muslim women. It's not reachable for some, and it's not quite known. Not a lot of women or young girls know the language that we use when we describe oppression, discrimination, and so on, and the bias, the sex. They don't have the language. They know it's wrong, they know something is wrong, but they just don't have the knowledge, because there's this gap. And I also agree with Nurhuda, this is a privilege, but there's this huge gap that we sometimes cannot reach out, and it's still a challenge for us until today. So knowledge is still important to be disseminated everywhere, and that's what we're working on, and especially making it accessible, because even if we have the language in our own language, it's still so hard for them to understand what it is. Even if, let's say, if we have it in Malaysian or in Maldives or in Indonesian, it's still so hard to explain to them and to make them realize that it's so embedded in the system. So yes. This is still a challenge for me to answer. I don't have all the answers here right now.
Yeah. And I mean, you brought up several key points. So definitely access to space, but also accessibility to knowledge. And it reminds me of something, yes.
And we're still very able-bodied, and also we with disabilities as well. And so it's still a challenge until today, because I've been trying to communicate and connect with other feminists.
Yes, in sign.
They're feminists, and it's so hard to okay, how do we do this? Because to be able to provide an interpreter who knows sign language, it's very expensive.
Yes, that's a great point. So it takes me to, I've seen your videos where you're doing sign as well, and I think they're brilliant. So well done. And so to Nabila, I remember a video of yours as well, where I thought it was brilliantly delivered on TikTok, where you had the marriage contract up behind you, and you basically pointed out that there was no space for a woman to sign on her contract. And you weren't saying much, you didn't use this academic language, but the message was clear. And so my question to you then is, how can we continue to get involved? And I think that was a part of a specific campaign. So what are the other campaigns people can get involved in Sri Lanka as well?
Zuleika, you're too kind. That's number one. And number two, I think, so that was a specific campaign for done last year for the Let Her Sign campaign. So what that meant was, so currently in our MMDA, or Muslim Marriage and Divorce Act, Muslim women cannot sign. There is no proper age limit for women. They can go really young as child brides. And also women cannot be qazis, and there are lots of issues with no conditions for polygamy and things like that. So for a large number of decades, like now, people have been and women have been asking for reforms, and finally we're at a place where the Ministry of Justice is taking it seriously, and last year we were promised reforms. And from then, last year we were told in January that you will get get word on this, but we still have not heard anything from that, except for the fact that in two weeks we will hear from the cabinet on their decision on the reforms. Here it's really important because being a minority community and coming from also having very conservative elements and groups in our community as well, there's such a power balance between protect the MMDA or protect our laws versus take them off or repeal our laws. And there's a small group of people, or there's a movement of us asking for reforms and not repeal, and to not keep protecting systems that don't work, because that is what the Muslim personal law has become now. It's a system that doesn't work, but yet we keep subscribing to it and we keep saying it's okay, but it's harming so many people, men and young women alike. So for me, to answer the action system, I think it's to be aware of what's going on, to understand the different political scenes that are happening, to be more sensitive to the issue, to understand what women are going through, and to also understand how these laws come about. You know, I can't call my uncle up and say, hey, let's reform laws. That's not how it works, right? We have to understand legal jargon, we have to advocate, we have to lobby, we have to really work hard and explain these languages to people. So I think I'll just end with saying it's a very exciting, nervous, and anxious time for all of us. We don't know what these 2 weeks will bring us, but we really hope that they deliver, and we have a law and we have a system that will treat both men and women equally and protect people in our community.
Thank you, Nabila. And it sounded like very critical moments in Sri Lanka. So yes, everyone, please follow Nabila after this so you can get involved and support them as well. And I mean, it's a perfect example of those forces and political interests that we've been talking about. And I think before I end and I hand over to Fatima to talk about how to get involved in the campaign for justice as well, I want to say that these are very, very long-standing legacies of patriarchy and practice that we're talking about. And we know change is not going to happen overnight. We've talked about burnout, we've talked about solidarity, and we are at what is hopefully, fingers crossed, the tail end of a global pandemic and health crisis. So my few points to add to action is also express and build solidarity when you can, and practice collective care in whichever way fits you and your communities. Take a break and be kind to yourself, because this is a long road and it's a long battle. And we want you to stay, as Dea said, brave and bold and fearless. So with that, I'm going to hand over to Fatima to talk about the Campaign for Justice and take us home.
Thank you, everyone. This has been fantastic. One of the most moving conversations I think we've ever had at Musawa, especially with all of you friends and colleagues. But I think just to kind of end this at in a more actionable note, so the Campaign for Justice, I think, like I mentioned, we have goals through this campaign because it pertains to countries with codified Muslim family laws and court systems, codified practices on marriage and family, upon entering marriage, during marriage, at the time of divorce and marriage, and other women's rights issues also as a part of it. So through this Campaign for Justice, we have this goal. We want to reform laws, but we have short-term goals in order to get to that objective in over 30 countries where there are codified Muslim family laws. And some of the ways that you can get involved, and I think we've just shared one resource, we can reshare it again through our advocacy toolkit, where we have already laid out the steps of how all of you can organize in your own communities through reading up on resources, aka knowledge is power, that every one of you mentioned, which, by the way, we should reclaim as feminists. And we also have, I think we have Read, we have Mobilize. Well, I don't think we have Mobilize. sorry, I have to go back to it. Inspire, yes. So being inspired by older movements, by older Muslim women movements like Kupi from Indonesia, like Sisters in Islam from Malaysia, a long time coming, and how they have fought against these systems in their own ways, whether it's through the media or whether it's through actual legal reforms. Then we have Persuade. Persuade is the third part of the advocacy toolkit, where basically you will use all these resources, the scholarship and the activism, to make the case for the necessity and possibility of reform. Because of these rich diversity of interpretations, we have juristic opinions within Muslim legal tradition that's echoed in a lot of these diverse Muslim family laws around the world. What we know that no two countries are exactly the same. So how do we put all of these diversity of facts, information, and knowledge together and persuade these various different groups? Because there are very, very different groups that feel differently about basically what we're talking about is Islamic feminism. And of course, finally, last but not the least at all, is to mobilize, which I think we will stress on all the time, because this is where we showcase the world our resistance to inequality and injustice that is rooted in only advocacy, because we are on the ground, we're everywhere. So now what we have to do is, through this movement, through this campaign for justice, this global campaign for equality and family law, is to organize for the right moments to push for law reform in each of the contexts: Sri Lanka, Malaysia, Indonesia, and many, many more countries that we haven't even touched on today, so that we can make space for these opportunities and these conversations for a more just and egalitarian world that we basically want to live in as women and as feminists. So please tune in to all of the other future episodes, but most of all, just go read up on the advocacy toolkit, because it has everything that you need. It's a one-stop online resource. And if you want any more information or have any other suggestions to collaborate in this movement, because like Dea mentioned earlier, it is all about collaboration, whether it's intergenerational, interracial, inter anything really, because of how diverse we are, our needs and our different abilities. We're differently abled people. So it's good to always keep learning, and we are open to always learning. So with that, I would like to thank every one of you for being with us today. I'd like to thank the Musawa team at the back end, for sure, who have been tirelessly working behind the scenes to make this happen. There are lots and lots of people here, but before we go, I also would like to just plug in to follow Dea, Nabila, and Huda on their social media platforms. These are just for Indonesia Feminis, Sisters in Islam, and a Sisterhood initiative, but of course, feel free to interact with them. They also have their personal and social media handles that they can, I guess, also put in the chat if you want. And also, please do follow Musawa, join in the conversation. The conversation, again, never ends. We keep learning, whether we're new, whether we're young, whether we're old. I think what always brings us together is the fact that we just want to be on equal terms with everyone. And we want everyone to be given justice to all of the issues that they've gone through in their lives, especially the women and girls that we are thinking about today, we're celebrating today, and we're always going to be looking up to also today, because without them, Musawa wouldn't be where we are today. I wouldn't be where in Musawa. I wouldn't have met Zul and all of these amazing women right now before you. So yeah, it's an emotionally uplifting day that we're having. And I hope this just keeps up for each and every one of you watching. But just before you go, just really quickly, if on Zoom, if we can ask you to answer a poll that just takes around 5 seconds to fill out, just to understand what you thought about and get your feedback on the webinar. So that it helps us greatly in organizing these events. So please spend a couple minutes on the poll. And finally, the video recording of this webinar and all the webinars that were part of the conference will be available on our Facebook page and YouTube channel. I just want to end really quickly with a quote, and this may be very unlikely to everyone. This is from Frederick Douglass, an African-American abolitionist, who was also actually a women's rights activist in his own right at the time when slavery was rampant. He said something on reform, and I just want to read it out quickly before I close this. So he said, "Let me give you a word of the philosophy of reform. The whole history of the progress of human liberty shows that all concessions yet made to her august claims have been born of earnest struggle. The conflict has been exciting, agitating, all-absorbing, and for the time being, putting all other tumults to silence. It must do this or it does nothing. If there's no struggle, there is no progress. Those who profess to favor freedom and yet deprecate agitation are people who want crops without plowing up the ground. They want rain without thunder and lightning. They want the ocean without the awful roar of its many waters. This struggle may be a moral one, or it may be a physical one, and it may be both moral and physical, but it must be a struggle. Power concedes nothing without a demand. It never did, and it never will." Happy International Women's Day, everyone. Please applaud yourselves and celebrate yourselves today and give all the love that you can for yourselves too. So thank you so much and hope to see you soon. Bye. Nabila, Dea.
Thank you, Musawa. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks so much, everyone.